Thank you very much. So yeah, as I said, my name is Nick Jefferson. I'm currently a sixth-year architecture student at the University of Nottingham. What I've got to present is my fifth-year final project, which is entitled Inhabitation Off-Grid Co-Housing in Nottingham. So that was the entire brief for the year, and my personal project was Rural Agrarian Urbanism. So essentially it was the idea of bringing sort of the rural principles and the idea of cultivating land into the urban fabric, and using it as a catalyst for sort of driving like a social engagement between the inhabitants of the housing block. Essentially our entire brief was to create a co-housing community within Nottingham, and trying to create sort of a low-rise, high-density and near-zero demolition adaptive retrofit project within the urban fabric. So our site was the People's College, which is at the foot of Nottingham Castle, so quite an interesting site. Essentially, creating a community which is embedded within the city with an emphasis on visual connections between clusters of residents and the wider general public, layering the physical and visual separation of the between the two realms, making prevalent use of urban growing to not only offer a focal point for engagement through a cohesion between food production and the observation and distribution to the general public. So that's trying to have the cultivation of land as a social engagement between the residents and also the wider general public to keep it sort of embedded within the city itself. So trying to incorporate more user groups. With the apartments that I proposed, I've tried to keep it between like 1 and 3 beds to cater for varying needs from sort of young professionals to families as well. So like I said, so this was the People's College at the foot of Nottingham Castle. So just to the southeast of the site is the new Broadmarsh development, which has been proposed at the moment. So trying to feed that into the scheme, so creating some sort of public green route through the site or ground floor permeability to try and encourage the general public to sort of engage with the site itself. And then looking at the houses which border to the north and south, so looking at the visual connection between these and the potential overshadowing. And similar to the sort of sustainability sort of things that you want to incorporate into the scheme, so rainwater harvesting was one thing that I looked at. And then also looking at maintaining views, so these were all the principles that I sort of looked at the start before I started to get into the design process. And then same as I said, so rural principles and urban growing. And these were just the initial set of principles which I sort of kept as my main briefing when I looked through my scheme. So autonomy and self-sufficiency on the site, alternative technologies, a focus on readily available materials, off-grid in regards to water, maximising the utilisation of the existing structure as much as possible, and also maximising sunlight and water access as well. So my initial sort of sustainability strategies, we're looking at retrofitting a double skin facade to the existing 5-storey block, trying to incorporate a passive stack through the centre of that, basically to drive the ventilation and energy through the scheme. Rainwater harvesting, as I said, and trying to reuse as much of the existing structure as possible. So looking at ventilation as well, so any sort of the apartments that I've incorporated, I've tried to incorporate cross ventilation to sort of mitigate the energy input that's needed for that. Looking at SUDs as well, so the potential of utilising the sort of high elevation fall through the site to drive the rainwater collection. Lighting as well, so making sure that the height of each of the sort of dwellings is able to sort of access enough daylight to fill the entire area. And then same with the energy production and supply, so trying to incorporate PV panels and trying to reduce the energy consumption of the site itself. Now what was interesting about our particular brief was we were paired up with an engineer at the university as well, so one of the master's students working on the environmental engineering program. So they had a similar sister site which was in Fareham, and sort of we collaborated together to try and create this idea of an off-grid community in Nottingham. So any of the sort of agricultural waste, urban waste and biomass which was created on my site would then be transported to this sister site, which the engineer would work on, and then anything energy, food production and water offset would then come back into the site to try and keep this cohesion as well. So that's the existing site plan, so just next to the castle, and that's the proposed Broadmarsh development, which was quite important driving force into the scheme itself. So for the proposed site plan, my initial, I had a sort of fine art precedent which I had with this, which was Clifford Harper, which was these initial set of illustrations, which was sort of his idea of urban utopia, which was based on community engagement and food production, which I sort of took as a starting point. So for the existing plan, which the elements that I'm trying to take away, so we're trying to mitigate the amount that's being removed and the stuff that is being removed, making sure that there's a purpose behind it and anything that is reused as much as possible. So my sketch site plan, basically the idea was that to the northern end of the site would be the more public realm, which was a bit more of a permeable area, which would feed into the broadmarsh space, and then towards the south would be the more private sort of residence space with private gardens and co-housing elements. So that's just graphically shown. So towards the side, that red area would be the more private realm, and moving up towards the top would be the more public realm. So this was just the site of the main housing block. You can see just to the left of that, sort of the large cliff face and wall which borders the Nottingham Castle. So it acts as like a second facade, really enforcing on the housing block, which is something I needed to look at. And there's the Long Street section from the east side, so it shows the sort of drop of the site, which obviously needed to be quite thoughtfully considered through the scheme. And that's looking towards the city centre from the opposite side. So again, that's showing the sort of large drop through the site, which was quite a difficult thing that I needed to tackle. So I sort of implemented them initial sustainability strategies, which I talked about earlier, and sort of implemented them into the scheme. So on the northern side, so this was the more public realm, looking at adding strips of glazing and ribbons of light within the scheme to sort of reduce the need for artificial lighting, trying to engage views into the public realm from private realms, and sort of making sure there's enough light access as much as possible. And on the southern side, so on the left side, there's the passive stack in the main residential block. So that drove the sort of energy strategy for that block. And it also acts as a light well as well to sort of reduce that artificial lighting need as well. So the rainwater harvesting on the top, and then the double skin facade on the, which was retrofitted to the front of the scheme as well. And then moving down, going into the more glass houses and more food production areas as well. So they'd sort of also would need a lot less energy consumption as well. So that's the existing scheme and the proposal which I finally got to. Looking at external perspective, so you can see the external armature which has been added. So that's a glue lamp post and beam structure which has just been retrofitted to the front of it. And then similarly towards the back, which acts as the main walkway and access to the properties. So this is the main housing block. So across this armature, there is elements of double skin facade, winter gardens and balconies where they associate with the dwellings on the interior spaces. So this is just a cross-section through that main residential block. So the passive stack through the central part. And then as a co-housing block, this has been split up into 4 clusters. So essentially clusters of 6 or 8, which is where these will act as like mini communities for social engagement, with elements of sort of communal space for them to engage with each other. So along the ground floor will be the completely communal space that everyone within the housing block will be able to utilise. So looking at communal dining spaces and workshop areas where they can engage with each other. And the plans above, so as highlighted here, so the green areas would be the communal areas where all the residents would be able to engage with each other. And these are double height spaces to try and penetrate that light as far as possible into the plan. Now the plans themselves have been sort of driven and designed through the idea of making sure that each has access to dual aspect and can be cross-ventilated, and as well having access to southern light. And as well they've been made so that the areas which are most utilised would be along the south facade, so sort of the living spaces and kitchen areas towards the south and the bedrooms towards the north. Yeah, so again, similar as what I've just said. Those are the communal areas, so yeah, so they'll be situated within these small clusters of residential apartments. Now for the construction, being a retrofit project, it was important to understand the existing structure, which is just it's just a concrete post and beam structure with infill concrete blocks and concrete green tiling. So being able to retrofit this, looking at externally insulating the existing structure and adding that external glue lamp facade and armature, which adds that sort of double skin facade and external spaces sort of to act as an environmental strategy and extra space for the residents as well. That was one of the working details that I worked on, so that externally insulating the existing concrete blockwork. One of the precedents I looked at, so that's looking at sort of the external materiality, which was Jonathan Hendry's Kingsfield Pond. And that's looking at just sort of the internal inhabitation of the spaces, so how each of the residents is able to inhabit each of them themselves and add their sense of individuality to the spaces. Sort of, and trying to keep as much of that southern light aspect as possible. For the roofscape, so I've looked at trying to keep as much as existing as possible. So this was looking at retrofitting with PV infills, so looking at trying to use it as a design tool. And that was a fine art precedent to look at how to implement this as a design tool. So this was my idea for just retrofitting these sort of concrete vaulted roofs with zinc standing seam and PV infill. And that's looking at the interior light quality of how this might be sort of trying to create a bit more of an opening atmosphere in these spaces. And this was sort of mirrored on the south side, so these were the glass houses which using the existing steel frames and just retrofitting with a bespoke timber truss and creating some sort of external glazing elements to these. And that's how that would look. And that's just created a bit more of a cohesion across the site itself. And then finally, so obviously looking at urban growing is quite a big driving force in the scheme and driving social change. So one of the big precedents I looked at was our urban, so especially the agri-city, which is really sort of offering a bottom-up strategy which really enhances urban growing itself and sort of the idea of the culture and really trying to create some sort of social engagement with the residents and the wider public as well. So those were the 4 areas which I identified. So there's agricultural patches, grass houses, a forest garden, and a roof garden. So in terms of how those would actually work with the scheme, it's sort of one resident from each of the clusters would be able to have sort of ownership of that, and it'd be their responsibility to maintain and keep it going. And then they'd be able to be offered sort of preferential rates to try and keep incentivizing them to utilize these spaces and keep them into sort of good working order, and anything that's produced can then be put back into the community himself and used for communal meals and things like that. And just adding to that, trying to extenuate the sort of rainwater harvesting element within this agricultural space, looking at potentially retrofitting external rainwater harvesting methods to make it a bit more prevalent within the scheme. Yep. And that's the overall. And just going back to that initial Clifford Harper precedent, which I talked about earlier, picking out just the key ideas, so urban growing, the double skin facade, the inhabitation of the residents, the cohesion of the roofscape across the scheme, maximising the utilisation of the existing structure, and the community engagement. And yeah, that's my project on rural agrarian urbanism. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, if we start with the panel, any initial comments or questions?
A really excellent project, and so refreshing to see a student refurbishing a building, basically. And I mean, we're trying to encourage students to do that at NTU. This is actually the scheme that we're doing in third year on this particular site. So my question was, would you be willing to come and talk to the third year students?
well, absolutely, yeah.
We might even be able to pay you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a bit of a coincidence. I wasn't expecting that, but yeah, it's a really interesting site, though. It's a good one to do. Yeah.
Is this something you see yourself doing in the future, retrofit?
I think definitely. I mean, I feel like that's the way we've got to do it going forward, anyway. But yeah, I mean, personally, I've not been able to work on schemes of this scale, but definitely working with existing structures, I mean, I'm definitely passionate about that, and I feel like that's the way we've got to go moving forward anyway. So, yeah, absolutely.
Greta?
Yes, I really enjoyed seeing the sort of 1970s graphic style that you used and those reference graphics. How did you come across them, and have you reflected on I guess that movement from the 1970s and what might eventually have happened to that, and future of that kind of movement now.
Yeah, I mean, it was just trying to find something that was similar to this, sort of like an urban utopia of using the cultivation of land. And yeah, I managed to find those illustrations. I think this was a bit more of a modern interpretation of that rather than sticking with those initial principles. But yeah, it was really interesting to look into sort of that movement itself. But yeah, it was basically just the modern variation of it. So yeah, but I feel like the principles of like social engagement was still as key now as it was then. So yeah, that was really the driving force that I kept from those initial precedents. But yeah.
Yeah, I think certainly there's a lot of principles that and ideas and concepts that came out in the mid-20th century, which theoretically were good and kind of sound, but necessarily lacked the technology to execute them kind of to a point where they necessarily worked fully enough. But yes, glad to see you kind of looking back and seeing how to retrofit theory as well as the physical realm. Aisha.
Hi, I really enjoyed the project. I think, as others have pointed out, all the way from taking an existing building to bringing in different environmental principles in. All that while I was thinking, for example, you say rainwater harvesting, you're using daylight, reducing energy with materials. I was thinking, how much is enough? Like, how much water do you harvest, or how much energy do you save by daylighting? Do you have a measure?
Well, I personally don't, but like I said earlier, this was sort of a sister project. We were paired up with engineers, so they actually took my scheme and was able to sort of work out the amount of sort of water that would be utilised for the cultivation of the crops, and also that the residents would utilise themselves, and work out the amount of roof area that we'd need for that. And then similarly with the energy consumption as well, sort of like the electrical consumption for the residents to need to utilise their spaces. That was all worked out through their project. So yeah, I don't have the figures for that, but it was sort of able to be worked out, and it was feasible. But
Great, yeah. Great. And I may have missed this, but do you have a communal kitchen?
Yeah, so that was on the ground floor, so that
okay.
utilised all of the residents. So yeah.
I don't have a big garden, but vegetables tend to grow in just large numbers in 1 week. And you don't know what to do with them. So I was wondering if there's a system in place in a community like this where there's maybe a farmer's market.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was, so towards the northern end, I did go very, very briefly, but that'd be sort of a food market area, which would generally be sort of communal, sort of commercial areas, but there'd be elements where the residents would be able to like supplement their income by selling places in there as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Great project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom, question, comment?
Yeah, really enjoyed it. I thought it's a really ambitious proposal that's got a number of facets. So you're sort of looking at retrofit. You're also looking at land use across two sort of sites and how those connect, which was quite interesting. And then the social community dimension to it. And yeah, the sort of land use material angle is quite interesting, and something that Material Cultures talk about in their new book. I don't know if you read that.
Yeah, very recently, yeah. It's one of the readings on our new project that we've been given, so yeah, I have. It's really, really interesting, yeah.
So like these sort of different dimensions, are you like equally interested in all of them, do you think, or is there one that's sort of emerged as like something you're most keen to?
I think at the moment I'm quite equally engaged. I feel like it's something that I want to explore this year during my thesis, so I'll try and sort of narrow that down and see what really appeals to me going forward. But yeah, thank you.